Howdy gang, welcome back to the 1968 lecture. So in the previous lecture, we talked about the Tet Offensive from January to March 1968, and we ended up talking about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on 4 April 1968. When talking about MLK, we also talked about his growing radicalization, shifting from a sort of more moderate position to a more class-based position on social equality. So for the rest of the 1968 lecture, we're going to talk about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, on the 6th of June, 1968. And then we're going to talk about the Mexico City Massacre, the student-led protest that the government intervened in, the Mexican government, on 2 October 1968. I double checked and I've made sure that all the YouTube videos, A, are correct and B, are listed on your courses. Sorry, not on your courses, on the PowerPoint. I'm not expecting you guys to watch them all. The YouTube videos are there to just give you a sense of what's happening. So, for example, for several of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, you're looking 40, 50 minutes, the size of this lecture. So just watch or listen enough of it to get a sense of the themes that MLK is going for. All right, so let's talk about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy on the 6th of June, 1968. Now, Robert F. Kennedy, he is obviously the brother of the late President John F. Kennedy, also the brother of Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. After his brother's death, after JFK's death in November 22nd, 1963, Robert F. Kennedy had a period of searching. He obviously did not have the same access as Attorney General that he did under Johnson than he did under his brother. And many around him believed that Robert, had gone into justifiably a deep depression. What ends up happening is Kennedy stays on with the Johnson administration as Attorney General. He does some international work for him. But basically, afterwards, he sets up his own political system, his own political machine. Not a national political machine, although he did have friends, he did have supporters try pressuring Johnson to put Robert on the 1964 ticket. That was one of the many reasons why there was tension between Lyndon Baines Johnson and Robert F. Kennedy. But 1964, mostly into 1965. 1964 leading into 1965, Kennedy starts charting his own path. 1964, Kennedy leaves the executive branch, resigns as Attorney General, and runs for U.S. Senator from the state of New York. Obviously, he had attacks of being a carpetbagger, being an outsider, but Kennedy worked hard and managed to become elected as senator, the junior senator from New York in 1964. 1965, 1966, he starts making waves on the national level. He goes down south. Kennedy's focus was very much on the underserved, the underprivileged, which kind of, on the one hand, is kind of surprising, somebody born with a silver spoon in his mouth, helping out those less fortunate. On the other hand, if you've done any reading on the Kennedys, and I suggest even after this class, pick up a book on Robert or Teddy Kennedy. You'll see a sense of service in that family, a sense of purpose to help everyone. So it's kind of not surprising. And not only does he help those within his own constituency, for example, Bed-Stuy, Bedford Stuyvesant, a neighborhood in New York City. Very underserved, very underprivileged, predominantly African American community in the 60s. He starts setting up a cooperative between local business and local leaders to try to revive the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy. Him as a member of the Labor Committee and as a member of a number of other committees in the U.S. Senate, he takes trips down to the southern United States, down to Mississippi, and he really connects to the children there, seeing the deprivation that they're suffering. And so serving the underserved really became a mission for him. 1966, he takes a trip to Poland. He takes trips to South Africa. And he becomes a larger than life figure as a torchbearer for his fallen brother's legacy. Getting into 68, however, remember, President Johnson speaks to the nation on the 31st of March 1968. He withdraws his name as a candidate for president in 1968. Now, not only did the Tet Offensive push Johnson to abandon not abandon the presidency, but to focus less on politics and more on ending the war. Not only did Tet push him in that direction, but also the success of an anti-war candidate. Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, ran against an incumbent president in the New Hampshire primary, taking place on the 12th of March 1968, much later than you would find the Iowa caucus or the New Hampshire primary today. So Eugene McCarthy ran against Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. And Johnson polled 49%. Eugene McCarthy, a relatively unknown senator nationwide, polled 42% against an incumbent candidate. Now, McCarthy was not seen as a viable candidate coming into the 1968 campaign season. Had a limited name recognition throughout the United States. In fact, McCarthy himself got into the race thinking, no, I'm not going to win, but I'll be able to shine a little light on the growing anti-war frustration against an incumbent president. McCarthy's goal was to push Johnson, at least with respect to the war, a little further to the left. McCarthy himself was surprised by his strong showing in New Hampshire and the support and his support, particularly amongst college students. Tell me if that doesn't sound familiar. A relatively unknown senator going up against a popular, well-known Democratic candidate and gaining surprising support not just for himself, but from a younger generation. I mean, it sounds awfully a lot like Bernie Sanders. Johnson never took McCarthy seriously. Johnson, kind of paranoid when it comes to the Kennedys. Johnson believed that McCarthy was just a stalking horse for Robert Kennedy. What I mean by stalking horse is a means. He believed that McCarthy was a means for Kennedy to test his own viability as a candidate without outright saying, hey, I'm running for president. So to test the waters for Kennedy and test the strength of a potential campaign. And again, to bring in a modern analogy, McCarthy could almost be seen as the Bernie Sanders of the 1968 primaries, except rather as Sanders focused on economics, McCarthy focused on anti-war frustration. Now, Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, gets into the race shortly after the New Hampshire primary. He gets in on the 16th of March 1968 and quickly becomes a strong candidate, if not the frontrunner. Between March and June 1968, Kennedy and McCarthy run head-to-head in four primaries. They run head-to-head in the Indiana, Nebraska, Oregon, and California primaries. Of the four head-to-head contests, Kennedy would win 3, Indiana, Nebraska, and California, and McCarthy will only win 1, Oregon. Oregon then and now. Well, I mean, now it's seen as the, depending on your ethnicity, as either the hipster state or as the, oh dear God, all these white boys are racist state. So McCarthy's victory in Oregon is not surprising, but Kennedy shows his strength in winning in the Midwest, Indiana, Nebraska, and shows his strength demographically by winning such a diverse state as California. Not only do you have liberals, you have conservatives, African Americans, whites, Chicanos, Latinx. California can almost be seen as a microcosm of the United States as a whole. So Kennedy's resounding victory in California showed his strength as a potential national candidate. And so on the 5th of June 1968, RFK was in California campaigning and eventually winning that state's primary. Kennedy was leaving the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He was leaving through the hotel's kitchen when he was approached by Sirhan Sirhan, Sirhan, space Sarhan, Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian immigrant who shot Kennedy 3 times, once in the head, once in the chest, and once in the neck. Kennedy's bodyguard quickly tackled Sirhan to the ground, but the damage was done. RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, was declared dead 26 hours later, making Robert F. Kennedy one of only 2 sitting U.S. senators to have been successfully assassinated. The other, Huey P. Long of Louisiana, being assassinated in 1935. Now, there are several theories behind Sirhan Sirhan's motives. Some argue that he was motivated by Robert F. Kennedy's pro-Israeli stance. Again, Sirhan was a Palestinian immigrant, and we're talking 1968, so we're looking at, this is a year after the Six-Day War, where Israel launches a surprise attack against the surrounding Arab states. So some believe that Sirhan Sirhan was motivated by Kennedy's pro-Israeli stances. And so Sirhan thought of himself as protecting Palestinian interests. Some believe that Sirhan Sirhan viewed Kennedy as the candidate that will succeed as president, and so any pro-Israeli stances would be detrimental to the Palestinian cause. In fact, Robert F. Kennedy was shot on the 1-year anniversary of the Six-Day War between the Arab and the Israeli states. Other theories emphasize Saran's mental instability. Saran himself claims to have no memory of the event and tried to change his plea, going from guilty to not guilty many times during his trial, after he confessed to his actions. So some claimed that Saran had an insanity defense. In the PowerPoint, I have an excerpt from Ted Kennedy's eulogy of his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. And I'm just going to quote a bit of it here. In his eulogy of his brother, Ted Kennedy said, quote, "As he said many times in many places of this nation to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?" Robert F. Kennedy, seen initially as the shy younger brother of John, many in the political world viewed Robert as the enforcer of his brother. Um, many would many would tell stories of how they would talk to John F. Kennedy, and John would sort of put him off and say, "Okay, that sounds doable. Go talk to Robert. Go talk to Bobby." And they would go talk to Bobby, and Bobby would say, "Hell no." Bobby would not be his brother's yes man, but would rather be John's no man. He would be John's way of saying no without taking any political flack. But by 1968, many viewed Robert Kennedy as his brother's ideological heir, and in fact, some viewed Robert as a better man than John. He was younger and viewed as someone who could truly carry the nation into the future. And after RFK's assassination, the Democratic Party would essentially hold their nose and select Hubert Humphreys of Minnesota, Johnson's vice president, as their nominee. The fear amongst the delegates at the Democratic Party was that Humphreys would be too closely associated to Johnson, particularly closely associated to Johnson's Vietnam policies. Again, both McCarthy and Kennedy show the growing strength, their political victories show the growing strength of the anti-war movement, the anti-war sentiment. And so the fear amongst Democratic kingmakers was that Hubert Humphreys, the vice president, would be too closely associated to Johnson, particularly with respect to his Vietnam policies. Now, this is not to say that Humphreys had no support. Humphrey was actually the front-runner in the 1968 Democratic nomination process. But wait, Mark, I hear you say. You just finished saying that Kennedy was pretty much the front-runner. Going head-to-head against McCarthy, he won 3 states to 1. Yes. But McCarthy and Kennedy were fighting it out in the limited amount of primaries. Not unlike today, not every state held a primary or caucus in 1968. Humphrey was working behind the scenes with the various state Democratic parties, particularly those with solid political machines like Mayor Daley in Chicago, the New York state political machines, states that did not have primaries but had political machines that turned out the vote and was gaining delegates through that process. So to give you an idea of, even though Kennedy was seen as the frontrunner writ large, With respect to the delegate count, at the time of the California primary, Humphrey had a 168 delegate lead over Kennedy. By the time of Kennedy's assassination, just after he clinched the California primary, Humphrey had a 168 delegate lead over Kennedy. Humphrey had 561 delegates. Kennedy had 393. So while Kennedy had the momentum, Humphrey was working the system. So what likely would have happened had Kennedy not been assassinated was there would have been negotiations in 1968 between Kennedy supporters and Humphrey supporters. And likely what would have happened is you would have initially had a deadlocked primary where not one person achieved a majority of the delegates. And then negotiations between the various states, between the various nominees would have happened. And it would have been a political circus with, I would suggest, Kennedy likely coming out on the top. So that is the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. I highly recommend, if you have an opportunity, to read up on Robert F. Kennedy. I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm going to get the actual name of the book, which is in a book pile right over by my desk. All right, my apologies. So I have the book in front of me. If you are interested in how Robert F. Kennedy shifts from a political operative to a beloved politician, the book is The Revolution of Robert Kennedy. The Revolution of Robert Kennedy, From Power to Protest After JFK. The author is John, John, R. The last name is Bohrer, Bohrer. So if you're interested in learning more about Robert F. Kennedy, I highly recommend Bohrer's, Bohrer, book. So let's talk about, and this is one of the, I do wish I had more knowledge. I wish I had more, a better idea of what is going on in Mexico at the time. But this is one of the times where we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into what's happening in Mexico. Now, we're going to talk about what's referred to as Terror at Tenochtitlan, Tenochtitlan, also known as the Mexico City Massacre, on 2 October 1968. Now, Mexico was undergoing some of the same tension that went through the United States and Canada in 1968. The country did have the additional tension with the Summer Olympic Games. The Mexico City Games, these are the games made famous by the two African American sprinters who, after winning the gold and bronze medals, hold up their fists in the Black Power salute and bow their heads. And so between July and September 1968, you have student protests in many of Mexico's universities. Similar to what you see happening in the United States, similar to what you see happening in Columbia, Berkeley, colleges throughout the United States and Canada. Now, initially, these protests expressed dissatisfaction at general government repression. The government generally overall is viewed as a repressive government, so they're protesting some of the repressive nature of the Mexican government in 1968. But quickly shifts to protest government intrusion in the autonomy of universities. Government intrusion in the autonomy of universities. Now, in some incidences, I can see why the government would intrude. on the autonomy of universities. In July 1968, for example, gangs, Gangs, as in the Crips and the Bloods type of gang. Gangs in Mexico City, were using the universities as safe havens to escape law enforcement. So gangs would be chased by cops or what have you. They would go on campus where, at the time, legally, police forces were not allowed to enter. The universities were seen as autonomous areas, and so police could not enter to engage in police activities or repressive activities, in particular, uh, um, going against free speech of professors, going and arresting professors, for example. And so on July 23rd, 1968, you have these protests going on, and riot police were called in to break up the student protesters and to round up suspected gang members. And so this inciting incident, riot police going into the universities in Mexico City to break up these student protests and round up suspected gang members, ignited greater protest not just in Mexico City but throughout the country as a whole. August and September have student-led protests not only in Mexico City but in other cities and other states throughout Mexico, throughout the countryside, led by a National Strike Council. Similar to the SDS, the National Strike Council was created to organize all the student protests throughout the country, to try to bring the student protest movement under one umbrella. August 1st, 1968, you have 50,000 students demonstrating in Mexico City. Near the end of the month, on the 28th of August 1968, you have another demonstration of 20,000 students. And this is happening at the same time as the eyes of the world are trained on Mexico City. We have the Summer Olympics going on. Although not as commercialized as today, the Olympics in 1968, 1960s, 1970s were still a high eyeball spectacle. Millions around the world watched the Olympics. So these protests, 50,000 students, 20,000 students, seen as a black eye for Mexico, for Mexico, and the Mexican government who at the time is trying to show the Mexico in the best light. On the 23rd of September 1968, the Mexican army occupies the main campus in Mexico City to start putting down these protests and start putting down these demonstrations. I mean, imagine for a second, members of the Princess Patricias, members of the Canadian Armed Forces, coming on campus and putting down the student union, or enforcing uh, a lack of protest on campus. Which brings us to what people have referred to as the Mexico City Massacre. 2 October 1968. On 2 October 1968, 10,000 men, women, and children gathered at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, Plaza of the Three Cultures, the Plaza of Tenochtitlan, to peacefully demonstrate against the government's actions. Protesters were chanting, "We don't want the Olympics. We want revolution." 5,000 soldiers are called in to surround the plaza and get into a position to put down the protests. On 2 October 1968, the government steps in and violently puts down the civilian and student protests, with at least 44 deaths and several hundred injured. With respect to the YouTube video that I put up, I would suggest starting at minute 26 and ending at about the 5.5 minute mark. That should give you a good sense of what's happening. Many historians of Mexico see this massacre as a point where the social compact, the social contract between the government and the people completely fall apart. If you look at modern Mexican politics, and I've actually talked to historians of modern Mexico, and they agree with me on this point, it really comes back to this point where all trust between the people and the government really falls apart. And again, I've talked to historians of Mexico. I have friends who are from Mexico who came to the United States and Canada to study, and they agree that the trust between the people and the government falls apart at this point and has not yet been completely repaired. This event has been referred to as Mexico's Kent State, as well as Mexico's Tiananmen Square. So I'm going to end 1968 there, and we are going to move on to our next lecture. We're going to move on to our next lecture, 8 Miles High, the rise of a counterculture and its effect on the media. We're going to talk about the counterculture, what we actually mean by that, where it comes from, drugs in the 1960s, rock and roll, and the counterculture. We're going to look at the two major festivals, Woodstock and Altamont, and then talk about the counterculture and the television. So I will, this is being recorded on the 30th of March, so that's a Monday. I will actually see you guys later tonight. Bye.